Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Josh, and we're your farm management hosts. Let's get started.
Josh, we're getting into spring and we've passed Easter, and I wonder what kind of activities you did and enjoyed around the Easter holiday.
Yeah, Bruce, for Easter, our family likes to get together. We go to church, and then after church, we go to our grandma's houses. And I have two different sides of the family that like to bounce around between each one. So we went to my one grandma's for lunch, and we went to the other one for dinner. Well, I ate a bunch of food at the first one. I ended up eating ice cream cake, dirt pudding, pumpkin pie. And then we went over to my other grandma's, and she had dessert too. And I was already full, but I am addicted to sugar. So when I got over there, she had peanut butter pie, she had cookies, she had cupcakes, and you got to try every single one. You have to try every single one. Bruce, I tell you, I don't know if I can eat desserts ever again. I felt so sick the day afterwards. I just kept piling in, piling in. And I don't know if anybody else has a problem like I do, but it's a very strong problem that I have. What about you, Bruce? What was
Well,
your Easter party like?
I bet you'll get over it. I bet you'll get right back into that dessert habit or trait. So we hosted Easter here at our house and had 48, 50 people here and kind of turned the tables. So instead of in addition to an Easter egg hunt for the little kids, I had go out and pick up sticks out of the yard hunt. So that was kind of put them to work a little bit as they were here, but everybody had a good time, good celebration.
Well, Bruce, we actually have a special guest today, person that has not been on our podcast ever. So our guest today is going to be Bruce Clevenger, the one and only Bruce Clevenger. He works with OSU Extension as a field specialist in the farm management with a statewide position teaching and conducting research as a member of OSU's farm office team. His background was 28 years as a county extension educator in Northwest Ohio, focusing in field crops, farm management, and specifically farm drainage and drainage water management. So Bruce, welcome to the podcast. How's it feel to be in the hot seat now?
Oh, the hot seat is warm. It's not hot, it's just warm. Thanks for the warm welcome, Josh.
So we're going to be talking about farm drainage and drainage water management. What are some of the underlying principles of farm drainage to first consider before we talk about calculating a payback period?
A payback period is where we're going to head in this episode, calculating that payback period. But there are some principles that I like to emphasize when landowners and farmers are talking about farm drainage and maybe more specifically now drainage water management. And we like to add in that drainage water management because drainage today, I think we need to think of it differently. We need to think of it more of a management and risk management tool, not just this old concept of, oh, we got to just get rid of the water as fast as we can. And I think we need to change our mindset a little bit about that. So for decades, we've had this golden rule of farm drainage. And the golden rule of farm drainage is to drain only what is necessary for good crop growth and trafficability and not a drop more. And I think that idea emphasizes a little bit of the economics, the rate of return to our investment, but at the same time, it also speaks to minimizing not to overdrain the farmland. That is a real concept. We can do it. We can overdrain the soil profile, but we can also have potential environmental impacts from excessive drainage. So there's a balance, economic productivity and environmental responsibility when it comes to farm drainage. So that's kind of the one principle. Another one is a reminder that intense farm drainage that we install, subsurface drainage, does not equal trafficability, meaning field operations. Think back in Ohio here, 2019, we had weeks upon weeks upon weeks of rainfall. We had intensive drainage systems in many parts of Northwest Ohio, but yet with that intensive drainage, we still had 80% of cropland in some counties that went unplanted that year due to that excessive rainfall. We just never had the opportunity for evapotranspiration to move intensive drainage into field trafficability. So intensive drainage does not automatically equal trafficability. So it takes a little bit of that sunshiny and warm weather and the breeze blowing to get some trafficability. And the last key component of farm drainage is the importance of surface drainage. If a producer is looking at a rate of return, the first dollar spent on surface drainage is really the most important part and the greatest rate of return on investment when it comes to farm drainage.
So when we look at Ohio and the other states across the Midwest, why is that farm drainage? Why is it so important for so many decades in this area?
Yeah, so many of our soil types have seasonal high water table. This is speaking to groundwater. This is speaking to that seasonal wet soil condition, high water table in the spring and sometimes in the fall of the year. Some of our soils are naturally poorly drained. The high clay content just does not allow a natural permeability of that water to move through the soil profile by gravity. And that happens in the spring and also in the fall. Another component as to why we have intensive drainage across the Midwest is subsurface drainage was first installed as a conservation practice, and it still is. It can and does reduce soil erosion because having subsurface drainage installed into a soil profile allows that water to move down through the soil profile versus across the surface. And when we have water moving across the surface, we have a tendency to have more of that soil particle picked up and moved off site. If we have more of that water moving down through the soil profile, we can reduce soil erosion by having properly installed and designed subsurface drainage systems.
So let's go back to a vocabulary word we just discovered a couple minutes ago. What is that payback period, and why did you get asked to make some type of calculation for this payback period?
Sure. Yeah. A payback period, by definition, we can say that it's the number of years that it would take for any of investment to return that original cost through the annual net cash revenue that it generates. So if we make an investment, we hope that that investment produces revenue. And it's that calculation that says, well, of that revenue that it's capable of producing per year, how many years is it going to take for that initial investment to be paid back at that net cash cost versus the net cash revenue that it generates? And so it's kind of a back of the tailgate, back of the envelope kind of calculation. It's really designed to be more of a discussion number to kind of get the ball rolling sometimes. And the why question, why I get asked to calculate this is because we have landowners, and those are either farmers or non-farmers that own farmland. They often know and they see the value of improved farm drainage because of the yield improvements and timely field operation, but it takes an investment of money and time to get that farm drainage installed. So often the cost of that drainage is paid for by the landowner. But nowadays, there are a lot of other arrangements where farm drainage might be paid by the farmer that is cash renting the land, or even shared that cost of the drainage between the landowner and the farmer that's renting or crop sharing the land. So there's these discussions about who's going to pay for the initial investment and what's the payback period to see what kind of payoff we might see from that farm drainage.
Bruce, you just gave a really good explanation of what the payback period is, but where do we get started? How do we get started calculating that payback period for that farm drainage?
So this is where we might get into a little bit of a deep water, or kind of we got to make some assumptions. And so assumptions we know can get us in trouble, but we hope that they are educated assumptions. And so an assumption would be we have to estimate the cost of material and installation for the type of system that we're going to install. So we're going to need to know what's the drain spacing, what's the cost of the main, what's the cost of installation for that contractor or the farmer to install that themselves. So that's one assumption, and we can get pretty close with some estimates. Also, we need to have an estimate on the cost of the money. As an economist, we need to make sure that we're valuing the cost of borrowed money, or even a producer or a landowner using their own working capital, their own cash reserves, as what we call an opportunity cost. And so that has to be calculated into the payback period. So the cost of money to get the project done. Then the next area would be expected yield increases. So every farm might have a base yield. We have an average of corn soybean yield over the past 5 years. What's that base current yield? And what do we expect to gain by improving that farm drainage? And then lastly, maybe the trickiest one would be expected crop prices. Where are the crop prices going to be today, this fall, over the course of 5 years for that? And so those are four of the basic areas of the assumptions that we have to make when we do these tailgate or back of the envelope calculations about payback period for farm drainage.
Bruce, there's a saying that if it don't make money, it don't make sense. What type of yield increase can one expect to see if they install that drainage onto their farm?
That's a great quote, Josh. Yeah, the yield increase is probably the trickiest, I believe, is as we have made so many improvements in Ohio and across the Midwest on farm drainage, we have to really adjust what the yield assumption improvements are going to be because much of the research that's been done for decades, 50 years or more at Ohio State University, says that if we go from farmland that has no drainage and we make the proper installation of drainage, we can see pretty big increases in crop yields. For corn, the 25-year study looked at a 30% yield increase on corn when we go from undrained to drained on soils in Northwest Ohio. For soybeans, it was 23% yield increase. So that's great. Those numbers are impressive. But I put cautions on that because how many of our current farmland acres are truly undrained? And so often we see farm drainage improvements being done, but we already have some past improvements that we've already seen some of those big increases over time. So we have to be careful not to shoot for the moon or expect 30% on corn or expect 23% yield increases on soybean because some of our farmland landscape has already seen some improvements. So we have to be careful. And what I've observed working with some drainage contractors is that some drainage contractors are reluctant, and rightly so, reluctant to say, you will see, as a customer, you will see X percentage yield increase or so many bushels of yield increase. So that assumption of what to expect on yield response is one of our challenges in calculating this payback period for farm drainage.
So Bruce, you told me that you've made a calculator to calculate this. Is this something that we can download on an app? How do I access it? And could we run through an example?
Yeah, let's run through an example. Yes, I do have a calculator. It's an Excel spreadsheet. We'll be able to share that with folks that are interested, and then we have some plans for the future on that. So yeah, the calculator takes these four areas of assumptions and allows us to put a number in. For example, what's the drainage system look like? What is the lateral spacing that we're going to install? So let's say, for example, our first example here, 40-foot drain spacing. We know that a 40-foot drain spacing is going to need so many linear feet of tubing per acre. And that linear feet is about 1,000 or 1,100 linear feet of tubing at a 40-foot drain spacing per acre. So knowing that by design, we can estimate the cost of the corrugated plastic tubing, the tile. In 2025, I surveyed 4 manufacturers of corrugated plastic tubing, and I came up with an average number of the cost of 4-inch corrugated plastic tubing, and we're using 36 cents a linear foot. And so I feel pretty comfortable about that. I also use, well, what does it cost to install that tubing? Ohio State University has a great survey data set that describes and collected data from contractors on what's the cost of installing that tubing. And so we're using about a 40-cent per linear foot of lateral installation for 4-inch tubing. So in addition to just the laterals, we also estimate the cost that a contractor would charge for surveying, making connections, fittings, also the cost of the main and all the installation that goes with it. So that can add 20 to 25% additional cost on top of the lateral material. So we have that in the calculator. Then also, again, that cost of money. So if I'm using my own money, today I'm using a 4%, which is about half the borrowing rate. Let's say an 8% borrowing rate for a loan. If I'm using my own money, I'm going to call that opportunity cost at 4% for a 5-year loan for that working capital that I'm using from the farm. So the calculator then also uses expected crop prices. So today I'm using $4.10 on corn. We can argue that. Today I'm using $9.50 on soybeans. You know, anybody can argue those prices. And then I'm putting in a base yield of corn production at 161 and 161 bushels per acre, and then soybeans at 48 bushel the acre. So that's typical yields for Ohio, typical prices for Ohio, and we have our material and installation costs. So with that all said, Josh, if we expect that 30% yield increase on corn and a 23% yield increase on soybeans, we would expect that that payback period would be just under 8 years of a payback period. We would generate enough revenue from that improvement to pay back the original price or the cost of that installation. Okay, so that's kind of an aggressive approach because that's assuming that we're going to get 30% more corn yield and 23%. But if we take that in half, if we drop that percentage down to 15, and we maybe assume that we're only going to get a 15 or a 16% yield increase, and maybe instead of 23, we're going to get maybe a 13 or a 12% yield increase, our payback really does double. And so that payback period goes from about 7.5 to 8 years up to almost 16 years of a payback period. So having the right assumptions in there into any kind of calculator helps the discussion between that landowner and the farm operator to really forecast what kind of payback period are we going to have for this drainage improvement, and really tamper and make it realistic, the expectations of what we might expect on yield improvements from a drainage system.
That sounds like an exciting calculator. I can't wait to see it when it comes out. Bruce, do you have any final thoughts for us before we let you go?
Yeah. So with that input, again, using the actual best estimates are going to be most important. Garbage in, garbage out on any calculator is going to be ideal to remember. The calculator does also estimate the total cost of the job. So let's say, Josh, I have my per acre cost estimated, but I can then replicate that into this calculator and say, well, my field is 55 or 60 acres. And so the calculator can also estimate the total cost of the project in total dollars. So I'm happy to share this Excel spreadsheet by email, by request, if people reach out. Glad to share that out. It is in a test version, but we do have plans to make it a web-based calculator here spring of 2025 into summer of 2025. And we look forward to any kind of feedback that we would have on this type of calculator. So hopefully it's helpful for conversations between farmers and landowners to really make the right investment into farm drainage. For those that are interested in the spreadsheet, feel free to reach out to me directly by email. My email is clevenger.10@osu.edu. Thanks for listening today.
For more information about farm management tips, be sure to check out the Farm Office at farmoffice.osu.edu.